When an individual is alone, it is more challenging for them to resolve a problem. However, when two individuals are present and face a similar issue, it is often more straightforward to find a solution. My wife's infidelity was a personal experience, but I was surprised to learn that a friend had encountered a similar challenge. We decided to address this situation and hold the involved parties accountable. On Wednesday, the doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. At 45 minutes past the hour on that Wednesday evening, the revelation of my wife's deception commenced. At that moment, she remained unaware. I opened the door to find myself greeted by a man and a woman attired in fairly ordinary business attire, albeit slightly outdated and exhibiting indications of their occupation. It was immediately apparent that it was evident that the visitors were law enforcement officials, not solely based on their appearance, but also because this was the agreed-upon meeting place for Frank and me to enact our revenge. "Good evening, sir," the woman greeted. "Are you Mr. Douglas Franklin?" she inquired. "Yes, I'm Dub Franklin," he replied. "May I inquire as to who you are and the purpose of this unexpected visit to my home?" At this hour, I fainted. Despite my suspicions, I was unaware of what was to follow. "Who's there, darling?" came Joyce's voice. My wife, the dishonest and deceptive, had been visibly jittery all evening. However, I will address this matter later. She was drying her hands on a kitchen towel as she entered the living room. "Connected to the front entrance," I replied, striving to maintain a degree of sarcasm in my tone as she approached me. A furrow appeared on her brow. "Are you Mrs. Joyce Franklin?" inquired the woman at the door, shifting her focus from me to my wife. The man accompanying her had not yet uttered a word and appeared to be. I must say that I am somewhat disinterested in this entire situation. "Listen," I interjected, attempting to feign irritation while secretly relishing what I suspected this encounter entailed. "You have been asking questions here on my doorstep without even telling me who you are and what this is all about." With a resigned exhale, the woman withdrew. Her hand emerged from her shoulder bag, and the man behind her withdrew his hand from the inner pocket of his blazer. They both simultaneously flipped their hands in a motion that seemed rehearsed and synchronized. Two police badges caught the glint of the front porch light fixture. I overheard Joyce, my spouse, let out a sound that seemed to be a combination of surprise and disbelief. The woman proceeded to introduce herself as Detective Sergeant O'Neill and her colleague as Detective Scurry. They informed me that they were investigating an assault that had occurred earlier that day and requested to speak with me and Mrs. Franklin. I had previously rehearsed my expression of surprise on several occasions in front of the mirror and was now ready to respond. The moment to test if it passed without raising any suspicions. "What assault? Why would you assume that my wife or I have any knowledge about such an incident?" I responded with a hint of escalating irritation, also rehearsed in my tone and demeanor. Glancing at Joyce, I noticed her complexion draining in her expression. She transformed into a state of sheer terror, avoiding eye contact with any of us and appearing on the verge of hyperventilating. The male investigator interjected, providing a detailed account of the assault that had occurred earlier in the afternoon, resulting in significant trauma to the victim prior to undergoing surgery. In his rare moments of clarity, he identified Joyce Franklin as the main witness to the incident. This assertion was further supported by multiple other witnesses present at the scene. I inquired who exactly was the victim, that is to say, my wife, the main witness. I paused momentarily, simulating the husband's genuine surprise was evident as I continued to portray myself as an oblivious fool, thereby contributing to the unfolding drama that was now unraveling my wife's clandestine world. "Mrs. Franklin, could you clarify the nature of your association with Mr. William Herard and what activities were you engaged in together?" "At the time of the assault in the rear parking lot of the Newton Motel on King Street earlier today," Detective Sergeant O'Neill inquired. "The incident was straightforward. The assailant was aiming for shock and awe. The facts were laid bare, and there was no escaping them." Joyce let out a distressed cry, and it seemed as though she might faint. I turned my head gradually towards my wife, regarding her with a mix of curiosity and surprise, or so I hoped. However, her demeanor shifted from shock to alarm and then to anger as she began to sob openly and retreat slowly from me. On Friday afternoons, the pace of work tends to ease up a bit compared to the remainder of the week unfolded in a similar manner. When my secretary, Jan, informed me of a call on line 1, I was not particularly occupied. Frank Simmons. I answered, "This is Deputy Gibson from the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. Could I arrange to speak with you for a few moments this afternoon or evening?" The deep voice on the other end responded. "Deputy Gibson, I am curious to know the purpose of your request." I inquired, realizing that Mr. Simmons must have already completed his end of the agreement for me to receive such a call. "I would prefer to discuss it in person." "Mr. Simmons, would it be possible for me to visit your residence later today or tomorrow? It is imperative that Mrs. Simmons be present for this discussion as well. Indeed, her presence is indispensable." The response was somewhat evasive. I was gratified that he could not discern the gratified smile on my face when I replied. "I must admit that I am perplexed but intrigued. Yes, you are welcome to come over. Does 7 p.m. work for you? My wife Cindy typically concludes her work at that time, and we will both be present at our residence when you arrive at 7 p.m. The call concluded with the understanding that I would see him at 7 p.m. I terminated the call, rotated my chair, stood, and took a deep breath. I felt a sense of fulfillment as I gazed out of my office window. That night, everything would be revealed. I was then struck with the realization that I needed to follow through with my plan completely. I had to call home to warn Sybil about the impending visit from a sheriff's deputy. Otherwise, she might suspect that I was setting her up. It was possible that she would suspect that I was setting her up. The house telephone rang several times before going to voicemail, which seemed unusual since Syl was expected to be home by this time in the afternoon. Perhaps she was simply occupied in the bathroom. I attempted to call again 5 minutes later with the same result. After waiting an additional 10 minutes, I left a message informing her that I would be home around 6. I informed her that I had received a call from Deputy Gibson, but that I was unaware of the details of the impending visit. I ended the call, reflecting on how convincingly I must have sounded like a clueless husband, conveying the message with just the right hint of concern in my voice. On Wednesday, I unleashed my pent-up anger by ranting and yelling at my frightened and tearful wife to ensure I did not escalate to physical violence. I made sure to express my emotions fully while Detectives O'Neill and Scurry were present, both as protectors of Joyce and witnesses to my actions. Once I had finished venting and had visibly calmed down, I proceeded to provide the detectives with all the information I could. I then left the front room and headed upstairs, having already decided what I needed to pack. The process of hastily gathering clothes and toiletries was straightforward. I then made a dramatic exit, stopping at the stairs with my suitcase and backpack containing my laptop. Meanwhile, Joyce remained on the sofa in the front room, sobbing. The narrative unfolded with the assistance of the two detectives, revealing that my wife had visited the Newton Motel on 2 occasions in her life. On both occasions, her purpose was to engage in sexual activity with a man named Bilvardo. However, the conclusion of her second visit was not as she had anticipated. The incident that ensued was far more eventful than she had ever anticipated. As they parted ways to head to their respective cars following Gerard and her departure from the motel room earlier that day, a hooded figure emerged from behind a van parked adjacent to Gerardo's Lexus. This took Gerard by surprise, as he was facing his car. The unidentified individual wielded a baseball bat in one hand and seemed to be. Joyce observed the scene for several minutes, seemingly unconcerned by the presence of the hooded figure. The figure attacked Tardo with great ferocity, inflicting severe injuries to his ribs, arms, legs, and genitals. Notably, the robber did not attempt to steal anything from Tardo. Instead, he looked at Joyce, holding the bat on his shoulder, and then shook his head. Joyce was overcome with horror and froze in place. The scene was abruptly concluded and the assailant vanished into a nearby convenience store. Passers-by began to notice Gerardo's injuries, with some rushing to assist while others stood by, filming the scene on their cell phones. Gradually, people also noticed Joyce, who was with Gerard. Several phones captured her image, according to eyewitnesses, who also reported that she had finally managed to break free. She was no longer constrained by her fear and had turned in panic to reach her Corolla. It required significant effort to insert the key into the lock before she could unlock and open the door. She then proceeded to enter the vehicle with haste. Once the engine had finally started, she departed the parking lot at a high rate of speed, with a few onlookers capturing images of her vehicle, including her license plate. O'Neill and Scurry reported that Mr. Herard had experienced periods of altered consciousness during his ambulance ride to the hospital. He was intermittently awake in the emergency room of the regional hospital, where he was able to respond to a few police questions and mention Joyce Franklin's name before being rushed into surgery. Once again, I must inquire as to the purpose of your encounter with Mr. Herard. Detective O'Neill's expression was devoid of emotion as she looked at my wife. I could see her falter, casting me the saddest look I had ever seen from her. Then, in a whisper, she said, "Doug, I'm so sorry." Her gaze shifted away, tears streaming down her face. It was only when I started screaming for an explanation that she finally admitted that she had met Herard at the hotel and had been in contact with him after that. After some time, she finally admitted that she had met Herard at the hotel and had been in contact with him after that. However, I was too enraged to hear her attempt to explain. I was under the impression that she was attempting to justify her actions, which was not the case. I had already formed my opinion based on the excuses commonly made by individuals who have been caught cheating. This was when I decided to I proceeded to pack my belongings and leave the residence, which I had occupied for the past 4 years. This was followed by a year of cohabitation and 3 seemingly blissful years of marriage. I found myself reflecting on the recent events, which had transpired just half an hour earlier. The 2 detectives had arrived, prompting my departure to the hotel room I had already arranged for a week's stay. Regardless of the outcome of this situation, I was aware that I needed to distance myself from the house immediately to maintain the facade. It was essential for me to mentally prepare myself to fulfill my part of the agreement with Frank. I had to psych myself up for what lay ahead. It was time to put on my game face and prepare for Friday again. Upon arriving home on Friday afternoon following Deputy Gibson's call, I was met with a series of unexpected occurrences. Gibson's call, I encountered several developments that were not entirely unexpected. Initially, I observed that my wife of 8 years was absent, along with her vehicle. After seating myself and retrieving a Yingling from the refrigerator, I glanced at the wall phone in the kitchen and noted the blinking light indicating a voicemail message I had missed. As I proceeded through the den, I sensed something. I was initially disinclined to dwell on the matter, but my anger prevented me from doing so. Upon reaching our bedroom, I sat on the bed to remove my shoes and shed my shirt. I then proceeded to remove my pants and place them in the closet, but I misjudged the distance and missed the hamper entirely. I observed that Ciel's clothes were gone and let out a sigh before heading back to the bedroom. Upon opening the dresser, upon returning downstairs, I observed that all of her undergarments and personal effects were missing. I was attired in slacks, a polo shirt, and moccasins, lacking the customary socks. I finally comprehended why the den appeared to be altered. Several of Cill's trinkets, photographs, and miscellaneous items were absent. I regarded this development with a certain degree of equanimity, as one might expect. After all, we had spent a considerable portion of our time together. He resides with her, yet I was still too enraged at the moment. Furthermore, I was obliged to maintain my composure when Deputy Gibson arrived shortly thereafter. Mr. Simmons inquired of Deputy Gibson at what point he had become aware of his wife's involvement with Mr. Philip Avery. My wife involved with Avery? I was overcome with confusion and surprise. Are you insinuating that my wife is engaged in an illicit affair with Avery? I inhaled deeply and closed my eyes, attempting to project an image of composure. Internally, however, I was struggling to contain my laughter until you spoke just now, Deputy. I was completely unaware that my wife was having an affair. I then opened my eyes, having just rubbed them with the forefinger and thumb of my right hand, which I had previously. My eyes were coated in Tabasco sauce, and my eyes were visibly red and tears were welling up as I addressed the deputy. I asked him, "Is this what was his name again, Avery?" He nodded slightly. I whispered as I sat down, "No, I had no clue." "May I speak to Mrs. Simmons?" The deputy, Gibson, inquired. "Perhaps she can provide some insight into our investigation." She was present and I informed her that her statement would be required. I shook my head, expressing bewilderment. When I arrived home, she had vanished, taking all her belongings with her. I suppose she has left me, as this is the only conclusion I can draw from this situation. It was time to shift my emotional gears and play the role of the AG, a grieved husband, convincingly for the deputy's benefit. It was time to. It is unclear precisely when the sheriff's office began investigating the affairs of promiscuous wives who betray their devoted and unsuspecting husbands while those husbands toil away to support them. I rose from my seat, pacing and gesturing dramatically, pausing. I shot the deputy a fierce glare, but he seemed unperturbed, displaying no signs of being impressed. He seemed somewhat bored. We do not investigate cases of adultery or Dianes, as you put it. However, we do look into matters when such Dianes potentially lead to serious crimes like aggravated assault and battery and possibly attempted murder, he stated calmly, his voice unwavering yet his gaze fixed on me, assessing my reaction. I once more adopted an expression of surprise, echoing Captain Renault's famous line from the movie Casablanca. In my mind, I muttered, I am shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. I am utterly astonished to discover that my wife has been unfaithful. However, do you honestly believe she would harm her lover, attempt to murder him? I queried, fully aware of the absurdity of my question. Deputy Gibson almost grinned as he drawled, No, I don't suspect she's done anything of the sort. What I'm investigating is who else might have had a motive to commit such an act. He then fixed me with a piercing gaze, as if to emphasize his point. Deputy, I assure you I was completely unaware of this liaison and I am not inclined toward violence. Might I inquire as to the time of the alleged assault? Deputy Gibson paused for approximately 10 seconds, seemingly assessing my reaction and considering the extent of the information to be disclosed while also evaluating my potential involvement in the matter. The incident occurred in the parking lot of a motel on Long Tree Road at approximately 8, on the evening in question. It would appear that the motel in question has a bar attached to it. The victim, Mr. Philip Avery, was a regular patron, often meeting with Mrs. Simmons. Unfortunately, Deputy Gibson conveyed this information without any visible sadness. He then proceeded to state that, according to the bartender, Mr. Avery had only consumed 2 drinks in the company of Mrs. Simmons. It is worth noting that both individuals appeared unsettled. After finishing their drinks, Mr. Avery went to his car in the parking lot, shortly after Mrs. Simmons left. There was an eyewitness in the parking lot. The witness reported seeing a man wearing a black ski mask wielding what appeared to be a baseball bat assaulting Mr. Avery by striking him in the upper back. Subsequently, while the victim was on the ground, the assailant, still masked, proceeded to beat Mr. Avery across his body, avoiding his head but showing a particular focus on striking his groin area. Here, Deputy Gibson paused, seemingly expecting some reaction from me. Whether shock, indignation, or culpability, I experienced none of these emotions. In our experience, Mr. Simmons Gibson resumed this type of attack, especially the specific. The targeting of certain body parts suggests a vengeful act typically associated with a cuckold husband seeking retribution against his wife's lover. I found myself unable to control my reaction to the mention of the word cuckold, causing me to flinch involuntarily. However, aside from that, I managed to maintain a facade of innocence and disbelief regarding my situation. Deputy, I began to recount my experience after a moment. I am still trying to come to terms with everything that has transpired, so please forgive me if I seem a bit tense right now, given the circumstances of my wife's departure and my recent learning. I was unable to complete my sentence, and the deputy nodded, feigning sympathy. However, there was a hint of expectation in his expression, as if he were silently urging me to continue and perhaps admit to something. I can assure you that I had no involvement in the incident you described last night. I was in my office with my office manager, Janet Barkley, finalizing our business tax filings until nearly 10 p.m. Aside from the connection you mentioned regarding my wife's knowledge of and relationship with this individual, Avery, I had no knowledge of the incident. You may contact her to confirm my whereabouts during the time frame you mentioned. Deputy Gibson simply nodded and remarked, Yes, I spoke to her right after you left your office this afternoon and before coming here. She has already provided your alibi. I had to feign anger to conceal any further information. What do you mean you already talked to her? Then why all the questioning and insinuations that I might be involved? Hey, calm down, Mr. Simmons. Gibson said, stepping back and he then proceeded to position himself in a way that would allow him to react if necessary. It is imperative that we investigate all potential angles in these cases. Given the precedent set by similar cases, it is likely that the husband will initially be considered the primary suspect, at least until evidence to the contrary emerges. Now that you are aware of my whereabouts during the assault, I suggested that we consider alternative investigative avenues and leave it at that for the time being. He then remarked, still attempting to unsettle me, that we should explore other investigative paths and leave it at that for now. I was forced to feign composure. If you have any further suspicions and wish to inquire, you can do so through my attorney. Mr. Simmons, Gibson interjected, calm down. He then pacified any hurt feelings with a calm demeanor and a steady voice. He advised me to contact the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office if Mrs. Simmons reached out to me. He also requested that I inform him of any communication with her. We will discuss this matter further tonight. I am truly sorry for the situation between you and your wife and for the way you learned about it. I will take my leave now. He put on his hat and headed for the door. As he was leaving, he turned to me and reminded me, if you hear anything from Mrs. Simmons, we would really like to talk to her. I simply nodded in response to his departure, closing the door behind him. I then exhaled slowly, returning to the dining room. This time, I reached for the wild turkey instead of the beer I had initially procured in the kitchen. After taking my first sip, I silently drank to my friend and smiled. He had gone through everything for me, just as I had done for him. I thought about my now ex-wife. I muttered, wife, and, sayonara, baby, to myself. The following Wednesday, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue seemed incongruous with the atmosphere one might expect in a divorce lawyer's office. Nevertheless, as a male, I found it difficult to resist flipping through it while waiting for my appointment. I had checked in with the receptionist at Chantel Hawk Domestic Law Office, a renowned divorce attorney known for her fierce advocacy for her clients. Rumor had it that she held a particular disdain for unfaithful wives, a reputation that had spread widely among the discontented married men in Woodstock and throughout Cherokee County. Other lawyers, some judges, and even a few law enforcement officials were said to tremble in her presence or at the mere mention of her name. It was now Wednesday, the week following the tumultuous events surrounding my wife's disappearance from my life. After scheduling an appointment, which was confirmed for today, I received an email from Miss Hawk outlining crucial steps to safeguard my assets. Subsequently, I proceeded to transfer the initial deposit to her account via my credit card. If you have encountered any of the online narratives pertaining to infidelity, you are likely aware of the necessary yet emotionally taxing tasks involved in preparing for a divorce, closing joint accounts, canceling credit cards, dividing savings and checking accounts, and updating beneficiaries for insurance and retirement accounts. Amidst these tasks, I reached out to I informed Doug about my appointment, particularly regarding the timing. I arrived approximately 30 minutes early for the appointment with the intention of engaging in a subtle charade. As I flipped through the magazine, glancing at the models in swimsuits, I noticed another individual entering the office and approaching the receptionist. "Pardon me," I said, "but I believe I may require the services of a proficient divorce attorney." A male voice, one that I recognized, inquired, "I believe I may require the services of a proficient divorce attorney." "Certainly, sir," replied the receptionist. "How did you come to learn about Miss Hawk?" The receptionist continued to assess the efficacy of Chantel Hawk's marketing strategy while gathering preliminary information from the potential client. After approximately 3 or 4 minutes of waiting, the receptionist informed the man that, should he complete the requisite forms, an appointment with Miss Hawk could be scheduled. Unfortunately, Miss Hawk was fully booked for the remainder of the day and the following day. However, an attempt would be made to accommodate the man on Friday. The man's voice conveyed evident sadness and uncertainty as he responded, "Oh, all right." There was a brief pause before he added, "May I inquire about the location of the restroom?" I then directed him to the restroom, which was located in the main hallway of the office complex. I informed him that he should exit through the door and turn left. This was my signal to intervene. I allowed the man approximately 20 seconds to use the restroom before setting aside my magazine and rising from my seat. I then flashed a smile at the receptionist. I informed her that I needed to use the restroom before heading in. I requested that she please let Miss Hawk know that I was still there. She replied, "Of course," and then returned to her duties. As I proceeded to the main hallway, I observed the man in question concluding his restroom visit at the urinal. I promptly surveyed the immediate vicinity to ascertain that we were the sole occupants of the space. Upon his completion of washing his hands at the sink, I initiated a conversation with him. I inquired about his well-being and the nature of his current state of mind. In response, Doug turned towards me and offered a peculiar smile. He then proceeded to convey that he had not previously recognized the extent of his own anger. In the previous incident, I had never before caused harm to another individual. He had been avoiding direct eye contact, but now met my gaze directly, admitting that it was somewhat intimidating. I nodded and said, "I understand." I then explained that we now had a valid reason for our meeting at a divorce lawyer's office. I wanted to ensure that he was aware of this. "Can you maintain this facade when we return inside?" Doug nodded and replied, "Yes, I can." He then exhaled, indicating his effort to remain calm. I offered him a reassuring smile. "Doug, you must remember that your situation is unique. We both recognize that. When you reach the third page of those forms, the page where they inquire about counseling and the chance of reconciliation, just keep in mind that 6 months later, I was not typically one to freak out, but this particular evening marked the 6-month anniversary since Frank and I embarked on our joint endeavor. It has been 1 month since Frank and I initiated our joint venture, which was born out of our shared frustration and desire to reclaim our agency. When Frank first approached me at my workplace and introduced himself, I was content and unaware of the impending changes. I was enjoying a comfortable life with a fulfilling job and a spouse. I believed that everything was perfect. Frank suggested meeting me after work, claiming that he had important information to share. Despite my initial skepticism regarding the lack of specificity in his proposal, I was ultimately persuaded by the allure of complimentary beverages and a meal. My curiosity and the potential for lucrative business opportunities ultimately prevailed, leading me to consent that evening. As he proceeded to recount his narrative, the cheerful world I had known began to fade, and my initial happiness gave way to a sense of unease. "She did not intend to betray you." Frank emphasized that he had shared with me photographs and transcripts from a private investigator's report detailing the investigation into Frank's unfaithful wife, Sile. Prior to that moment, I was unaware that my wife, Joyce, was collaborating with Sile, let alone developing a closer relationship with her. Joyce had begun going to lunch with Sile, who it appeared that Sybil was slightly older than Joyce. Recently, on days when Joyce stopped for drinks and to unwind after work, she was accompanied by Sybil. Frank's private investigator had uncovered information about Joyce's activities. Joyce seemed surprised when Sybil began hinting about her extramarital affairs with Frank. Although shocked, Joyce appeared somewhat excited and intrigued. Perhaps viewing it through the lens of her longtime fascination with romance novels, I now understood that Joyce found Syl's behavior thrillingly scandalous, although she herself would not engage in such behavior. She enjoyed hearing about Syl's escapades and pledged to keep them confidential as part of their girl talk for approximately 2 weeks. The two women had been meeting up for drinks, then one afternoon 2 men approached their table and requested to join them. Joyce was on the verge of declining when Sile promptly made room for them, welcoming their company. According to the private investigator's report, Joyce seemed noticeably upset while Syl appeared to be enjoying herself. Shortly after Joyce departed, the report continued to detail how Syl accompanied both men to a room in the motel building next to the bar. The following week, Joyce and Syl returned to the same bar after work. Bill Gerard and Phil Avery, the same 2 men from the previous encounter, arrived a few minutes later. Once again, they approached the women, who once again agreed to their company, according to the report. Joyce and Syl briefly left the table to visit the restroom during their absence. Bill Gerard produced what appeared to be a small vial from his clothing and emptied its contents into Joyce's drink, using his finger to stir. He then exchanged words with Avery, and they shared a high five and smiles as the women returned approximately 20 minutes later. Joyce, having completed her drink and reached for her purse, seemed to exhibit a slight lack of coordination in her movements. Syl attempted to ensure her well-being. The 2 men offered assistance to Joyce, who was exhibiting confusion, in guiding her to a location where she could rest and recuperate before considering driving anywhere. According to the private investigator's report, it was unsurprising that the man had a motel room available next door. The investigators noted that Joyce had succumbed to the man's advances on the first occasion, despite the presence of alcohol in her system. The fact that she had been drugged on a previous occasion and was subsequently blackmailed was a source of considerable frustration. However, what caused me the greatest distress was her apparent lack of trust in me, which meant that she was reluctant to confide in me about the situation and allow me to assist her in extricating herself from the problematic situation she had found herself in with the individual in question. I took a moment to compose myself, taking a sip of my drink. As her husband, it was imperative that she place her trust in me and allow me to defend her. It is imperative that I provide for her. What kind of man is he who cannot protect his own wife? If she does not trust me enough to confide in me, I am a failure as a husband. We sat in silence, staring at our drinks on the bar in front of us. Despite all of that, are you still working things out? Frank inquired. He was nursing a neat wild turkey, while I was enjoying an arrogant bastard ale. I am still somewhat upset with. I admitted to taking another swig from the unusually large bottle, but I will move past it soon. I have arranged for her to have a trauma consultation after such cases have been resolved. The same counseling center also offers CBT, so we have been attending sessions for the past 10 weeks. Doug, you are aware that Sile was deeply involved with those two individuals. Perhaps she was offered the opportunity to apply a prohibited substance. Frank interjected, attempting to provide support. He stated that the topic of substance use had been discussed with his wife several months prior. He then inquired about his wife's whereabouts. In response, Frank stated that his wife seemed to have disappeared. However, he speculated that she would contact him once her financial resources were depleted. Alternatively, he suggested that she might communicate with him through her lawyer. He reiterated that he still had the divorce papers. I began the divorce proceedings with Chantel Hawk. Chantel has suggested that I can change the grounds for divorce from adultery to irreconcilable differences or even abandonment if she remains out of touch for an extended period. Regardless of the grounds, I am indifferent. Frank interjected, still visibly upset. Frank would never acknowledge this, and I was not going to point out that his anger suggested he still had feelings for his ex-wife. Despite her infidelity, I had gained some insight into such matters from our counseling sessions. I commented with a smile that at least the separation paperwork had been finalized, thus she was legally free to decompress without worrying about adultery charges. Frank returned the grin, raising his glass towards me. He confirmed that he had indeed finalized the paperwork and took another sip. He then gazed into the distance for a moment. Frank inquired whether I had resumed sexual relations with Joyce. I replied with a smile and a simple nod. I was not inclined to discuss the specifics of our intimate life. After everything was revealed, it took a couple of months before we eventually resumed our sexual relationship. This occurred only after she had been in counseling with a psychologist for a while. The transformation was remarkable. Joyce appeared to be striving to atone for her actions. She began engaging in activities that she had previously avoided, including behaviors that I had never considered. The sound of movement behind us, accompanied by a clearing of the throat, prompted us to turn away from the bar simultaneously. A woman stood before us, clad in an alluring dark green cocktail dress that accentuated her generous the amount of her ample cleavage, and the fact that she was wearing a slit on one side of her dress that revealed a considerable portion of her thigh, left Frank and I without words. We were both struck by the sight of what might be described in British English as intimacy on legs. She then remarked that it appeared that we were acquainted, which ignited a spark of familiarity within me. It then occurred to me that she was Sergeant O'Neill. I was impressed by the policewoman's appearance. I had not anticipated that a police officer would be so attractive when not on duty. I was torn between two urges, to refrain from disclosing my recent encounter with Frank and to resist the temptation to gaze at the scene in front of me with open desire. The policewoman clarified that her title was Lieutenant O'Neill, but that was only her professional designation. When she was not on duty with her husband, she went by Mrs. Gibson. A man in a professional capacity approached. I did not recognize him, but I noticed Frank suddenly tense up. "Hello, Mr. Simmons," the man greeted. "I see my wife has introduced herself to you. I am Jeff Gibson." I arched my eyebrows in response, but remained silent. I handled Mr. Franklin's case with his wife for the Woodstock Police Department around the same time. Lieutenant O'Neill then interjected, "Or should I say Mrs. Deputy Gibson? She seemed slightly amused as her eyes shifted between Frank and me. I made a conscious effort to maintain a neutral expression. Despite our best efforts to maintain a neutral expression, Doug and I crossed paths at my divorce lawyer's office. Frank interjected after realizing our wives were acquainted and had some history with the men involved in those incidents. We have remained in touch, and we occasionally meet to commiserate, so to speak, except I interjected in an attempt to redirect the discussion away from prolonging the conversation. Frank's wife, for reasons unknown, suddenly departed. My wife and I are currently engaged in efforts to reconcile and move forward. Lieutenant O'Neill offered a brief smile and commented, "Mr. Franklin, it is encouraging to see you and your wife taking steps towards reconciliation. The investigation into Mr. Gerard's assault is still ongoing." She paused, waiting for my reaction. I merely gazed and took a sip of my beer as she continued. "He is still undergoing rehabilitation for his leg, but it appears that he will have a permanent limp. Fortunately, his arm is recovering well." She added that it was useful to have a handgun. I was not particularly concerned about Gerard's recovery, but I nodded anyway. His wife, Amy, divorced him and took their children and a significant portion of his finances. It seems that his reproductive capabilities have also been affected, while still functional, his sperm's motility. Furthermore, his sperm motility is also affected, which makes it challenging for him to conceive should he remarry. There was a hint of satisfaction in her tone, indicating that even female police officers find it satisfying to see unfaithful men face consequences. "Yes," Deputy Gibson interjected. "Frank, if you happen to communicate with your ex-wife, just inform her that we're still investigating. The incident involving Mr. Avery's assault, while his injuries were not as severe as those of Mr. Gerard, resulted in significant medical expenses. This occurred around the same time his wife, Wendy, filed for divorce." Frank snorted, remarking, "Deserves what he gets." Deputy Gibson and his spouse glanced between us, sharing their observation. Amused looks and silence settled in. "Have a pleasant evening, folks," Deputy Gibson remarked as he escorted his wife out through the front entrance.